With Hashem's loving grace, welcome to Moon Beams with your host, Lazer Brody. Today's podcast is entitled George Washington and the Light of Hanukkah. Few people realize that America owes its independence to one of George Washington's soldiers who lit Hanukkah candles in the year of 1777, and this was 5538 in the Hebrew calendar. And here's the story. America declared its independence from England on July 4th of 1776. So the British, they sent the General William Howe to quell the rebellion, and Howe's forces outnumbered, outflanked, and outmaneuvered General Washington's fledgling army of volunteers and new immigrants and freed slaves, a motley group of people that couldn't possibly call them soldiers, and certainly not veteran soldiers. So General Howe captured New York City, and in a very significant victory, he captured what the Americans then made their first capital, Philadelphia. And this was in autumn of 1777. So it looked like the newborn country of the United States of America wasn't going to live a very long lifespan. So the British, they won battle after battle, and they were a tenacious enemy alone. But in addition, they had 30,000 German emissaries helping them, and they were helped by the Tories, the Americans that remained loyal to Great Britain, and as well as the Iroquois Confederation of Native Americans, that they also fought alongside the British because they hoped to protect their lands from colonial expansion. Winning the war for independence seemed hopeless to General Washington and his campaign-weary and poorly equipped and exhausted army. So regrouped and licking their wounds, they marched into their winter encampment in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, 6 days before Hanukkah on December 19th, 1777. Well, conditions in general, and the winter in particular, it bordered on the unbearable. The snowfall, along with shortages of provisions and clothing and shoes, they made living conditions extremely difficult. Well, the advantage of the camp, though, that it was on a plateau, and it was about an hour away from Philadelphia. George Washington, he had an inner battle, in addition to the external battle, he had an inner battle between the despair of giving up and surrendering to the British and making a new strategy and trying to march on Philadelphia and to liberate Philadelphia. But at this point in time, he was a lot closer to despair. And on New Year's Eve of December 31st, 1777, this was the 8th night of Hanukkah, General Washington decided that he'd make the rounds and personally check on the morale of his soldiers. Wrapped in his officer's coat and his three-pointed hat, he went from tent to tent, and some of the men were sleeping, and others huddled around small fires trying to keep warm. Well, in the opening of one of the tents, there was a young man, and he looked like he was huddled in prayer, but he was really leaning over a small candelabra, a Hanukkah menorah, and lighting candles. And this was one of the few possessions that this young man brought with him from Europe. He was a refugee from Europe, fleeing the persecution of Jews in Europe. But it must have brought him good fortune because he was carrying it around with his gear. Well, intrigued, General Washington asked him what he was doing. Little had the young soldier expected to find the commanding general of the entire army at the entrance to his tent. Well, General Washington was curious to find out what those little candles meant, what they were talking about. So they glowed so beautifully and illuminated the dismal darkness of winter in Valley Forge. Well, the Jewish soldier told General Washington about what happened in the year 164 BCE. This was 1,941 years before 1777. Well, the Greek army had conquered the Holy Land of Israel, and they defied the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, and they placed their idols in the most sacred place of worship, the Holy of Holies. Then he told General Washington about this priestly family from the Hasmonean clan. These were the Maccabees, fiercely loyal to the Almighty and their ancient faith. Well, they could not bear the Greek abominations and the evil of the Greeks, yet vastly outnumbered and poorly equipped. The Maccabees, they weren't soldiers at all. They were Kohanim. They were priests in the Holy Temple. They began a guerrilla war against their oppressors and miraculously overcame them. Then with the Almighty's help, they succeeded in expelling the Greek army entirely from the land of Israel. Well, the soldier continued explaining how they purified the sanctuary and finding only one container of oil which remained undefiled, they used it to light the menorah. Yet miraculously, that one vial of oil, which should have been enough for only one day, it lasted for 8 days. And that's why we celebrate the holiday for 8 days and light 8 candles, one candle in each night, add another candle each night. And he told the general that his prayer is recalling, it's called the Al-Anisim prayer, and it recalls the victory of the weak over the mighty and the few over the many and the good over the evil. And he says, like manner, sir, I pray for your success and for our nation's victory as well. And as I believe in God, I believe that our army will succeed also. So General Washington, he was enthralled. And he looked at the little flames and at the face of the Jew, the illuminated face of this young man who believed so strongly, the glow of insight and inspiration, it warmed the general's soul. So you're a Jew, he said to the young soldier, from the nation of prophets. Well, I treat what you said as a message from the Almighty himself. With your little lights and your inspiring story, you've rekindled the fire of optimism in my troubled heart. And the general shook the young soldier's hand, saluted, and then continued his rounds. Well, what happened in the coming months is history. Washington's forces, they scored a series of victories over the British, and this happened to be the beginning of the turnaround that led to total success, liberation of New York City, liberation of Philadelphia, and the full independence of the United States of America from England. Well, the Jewish soldier, he survived, and he returned to his home in New York City on Broome Street. And 2 years later, there was a knocking at the door when he and his wife were sitting at the dinner table. And the young man was amazed to see these two official-looking men standing there. He said, what they want from him? We had no idea. But a moment later, he recovered his pose and invited them in. Well, after introductions, one of the men stepped forward and gave him a small box with blue velvet, lined with blue velvet, and took it out from inside his coat pocket. He handed it to the Jewish post and saying, here, this is for you. So the veteran soldier, he opened the box, and it was elegantly lined and setting off with a brilliant gold medallion inside. And on the medallion was an engraved picture of a menorah. And on the other side was engraved on it with admiration from George Washington. One of the visitors handed him a letter from General Washington, and he said, this letter will explain everything. Well, in the letter, General Washington wrote, my dear friend, you cannot fathom what you'd accomplished that night at Valley Forge. I couldn't sleep that night because I was sure we had no chance of winning. We lacked ammunition, and the British outnumbered us 10-1. We didn't have food or bedding for the soldiers, and I saw our boys lying asleep in the freezing cold under those thin blankets. It just melted my resolve. So I contemplated surrender, and the situation appeared hopeless. But your lights and your words, they changed all of that. If it wasn't for your menorah, I don't know where we would be standing today, if we would be standing today as free men. So we decided to present this medallion to you as a testimonial to that night, which was a turning point in our struggle for freedom. Well, this, cherished brothers and sisters, was one of the favorite Hanukkah stories of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef of saintly and blessed memory. And may everyone have a lovely and illuminated Hanukkah. Amen.